A galaxy-ending war was seconds away. The Kryn matriarch's roar shattered the station's reinforced glass, her royal brood stolen. Humanity's first contact was about to become its last. But the universe's most lethal predators weren't kidnapped. They were napping, purring softly against the beating heart of a Terran engineer. The Aegis Vanguard space station was a marvel of modern human engineering, a sprawling metropolis of steel, glass, and artificial gravity, suspended in the cold void of the neutral zone. It was built for one singular purpose: to prove that humanity belonged on the galactic stage. But on the evening of the 14th of November, 2248, it became a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The United Nations Earth Alliance had spent 2 decades preparing for this diplomatic summit. The guests of honor were the Kryn Empire, an ancient apex predator species whose territory spanned 3 neighboring star systems. They were a race of towering, chitin-armored beings with a culture rooted in conquest, strength, and primal dominance. Ambassador Helen Mitchell stood on the observation deck, adjusting the cuffs of her immaculate navy blue suit. She stared out at the colossal Kryn dreadnought anchored just beyond the station's perimeter. It was a terrifying vessel, jagged and dark, resembling a floating leviathan more than a starship. Beside her stood Chief of Security David Ross, a veteran of the Orbital Defense Forces who looked like he hadn't slept since the Kryn arrived 3 days ago. "They're restless, Helen," David muttered, crossing his arms over his tactical vest. "My men are walking on eggshells. The Kryn Royal Guards don't do diplomacy. They patrol the corridors with their plasma halberds drawn. Every time a maintenance bot beeps too loudly, I think we're going to war." Helen sighed, rubbing her temples. "We just need to survive another 48 hours, David. If we can secure the trade agreement with Sovereign Vera, Earth gets access to the Tyrium hyperlanes. If we fail, the Kryn classify us as a prey species. You know what they do to prey species." The doors to the observation deck hissed open, and the air temperature seemed to drop instantly. Sovereign Vera, matriarch of the Kryn, entered the room. She was nearly 9 feet tall, moving with a terrifying, serpentine grace. Her iridescent black exoskeleton absorbed the artificial light, and her 4 crimson eyes burned with cold intelligence. She did not walk, she stalked. But Vera had not come to Aegis Vanguard alone. She had brought her royal brood 3 newly hatched sons, the future heirs of the Kryn Empire. In Kryn culture, a matriarch never left her young unguarded, and the hatchlings were kept in a specialized climate-controlled nursery in the diplomatic wing, guarded by her most elite warriors. Ambassador Mitchell. Vera's voice was a guttural rumble that resonated in Helen's chest, translated through a specialized neural implant. "The atmospheric pressure in my quarters is unacceptable. It lacks the humidity of my homeworld. Fix it." "Right away, Sovereign Vera," Helen replied smoothly, bowing her head slightly to show respect without yielding dominance, a delicate balance she had practiced for months. "I will have engineering adjust the environmental controls immediately." Before Vera could issue another demand, the station's lighting violently flickered. A heartbeat later, the blaring shriek of a Level 1 emergency siren ripped through the air. The lights shifted to a harsh, blood-red emergency glow. David Ross instantly tapped his earpiece, his face draining of color. "Ross here." "Report," he barked. Static hissed in his ear before a terrified human voice broke through. "Commander, it's the diplomatic wing. The Kryn nursery. The blast doors are forced open. The guards are unconscious." "Sir, the royal hatchlings are gone." David's blood ran cold. He slowly lowered his hand, his eyes locking onto Vera. The matriarch's crimson eyes dilated, sensing the shift in the human's pheromones. She did not wait for a translation. She knew. A sound erupted from Vera's throat, a sound no human had ever heard before. It was a deafening, primal roar of absolute fury and maternal agony. The acoustic force of it literally shattered the reinforced glass of the observation deck's holographic displays, sending a shower of sparks and synthetic glass raining down on them. "My sons!" Vera snarled, lunging forward and seizing David by the tactical vest. She lifted the 200-pound security chief off the floor with one clawed hand as if he were a rag doll. "Where are they?" Sovereign, please! Helen shouted, stepping forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. We don't know! The alarm just sounded. We will lock down the station! Nobody leaves! Vera dropped David, her mandibles clicking rapidly in a display of lethal aggression. If my brood has been taken by your kind, or if any harm comes to them, I will not just burn this station, Ambassador. I will signal my dreadnought. We will glass your homeworld until its oceans boil. You have one cycle. Find them. Within minutes, Aegis Vanguard transformed into a military fortress. Every blast door was sealed. The docking bays were locked, clamped down with magnetic locks. Hundreds of armed security personnel flooded the corridors, heavily armed and sweating beneath their armor. They were hunting for 3 alien hatchlings, but the terrifying reality was that the human guards were just as afraid of finding the Kryn babies as they were of losing them. Kryn hatchlings were not helpless infants. They were born as apex predators. Equipped with razor-sharp mandibles, acidic saliva that could melt through titanium, and a highly aggressive instinct to bite anything that moved, they were incredibly dangerous. A human encountering a frightened Kryn hatchling would likely lose a limb or their life in seconds. Down in the lower decks, far away from the polished glass and political tensions of the diplomatic wing, the station was a labyrinth of exposed pipes, roaring turbines, and steam-filled corridors. Sector 4 was the industrial heart of Aegis Vanguard. It was loud, filthy, and incredibly hot. It was also the domain of Samuel Reed. Samuel was a senior life support mechanic. He was 42 years old, wore grease-stained coveralls, and had a thick beard that smelled perpetually of engine oil and burnt coffee. He didn't care about galactic politics. He didn't care about the Kryn. All Samuel cared about was keeping the massive thermal regulators from overheating and turning the station into an oven. As the red emergency lights flashed in Sector 4, Samuel barely noticed. The alarm klaxons down here were always muffled by the deafening roar of the primary coolant nexus. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty rag, exhausted after a 14-hour shift. The ambient temperature in the nexus room was hovering around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, unbearable for most humans, but just another Tuesday for Samuel. He didn't know the station was in lockdown. He didn't know an alien queen was preparing to eradicate humanity. All Samuel knew was that he was tired. His bunk was too far away, and the makeshift cot he had set up next to the rumbling thermal generator was looking incredibly inviting. The search on the upper levels was descending into absolute chaos. Commander David Ross paced the central security hub, watching hundreds of camera feeds flash across the massive monitors. Beside him stood a contingent of Kryn royal guards, towering behemoths gripping their plasma halberds so tightly their armored knuckles popped. The tension was suffocating. Every shadow on the monitors looked like a threat. "We've swept the entire diplomatic tier," a lieutenant reported over the comms, his voice trembling slightly. "No sign of the hatchlings. The perimeter was breached from the inside. The climate control systems in the nursery failed entirely. Temperature dropped to substandard levels. It looks like the guards passed out from the sudden atmospheric shift, and the hatchlings just chewed through the secondary ventilation grate." David swore under his breath. They weren't kidnapped. They broke out. Sovereign Vera, who had refused to leave the security hub, loomed over David's shoulder. "My sons require immense heat to regulate their biology during the first molting phase," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Your pathetic life support systems failed. They escaped seeking warmth. If they encounter your soft, fragile species while in a state of thermal panic, they will slaughter them. And if your people harm them in self-defense, nobody is going to harm them," Helen Mitchell interrupted, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. "We just need to find where they went." David's eyes darted across the environmental readouts. "Wait, if they are seeking heat, where is the warmest place on the station?" An engineering officer frantically typed at a console. "The primary coolant nexus. Sector 4. The ambient temperature down there is hovering around 35 degrees Celsius due to a lagging heat sink. But, sir, Sector 4 is heavy machinery. It's a maze of industrial hazards. And there's a human mechanic logged in down there. Samuel Reed." Vera's eyes flared. "A human is trapped with my starving, panicked brood? He will panic. He will strike them. Move! Now! The matriarch didn't wait for permission. She stormed out of the security hub, moving with terrifying speed. David, Helen, and a heavily armed strike team of both human security and Kryn guards scrambled to keep up. They practically ran through the station's corridors, taking the industrial freight elevators down into the bowels of Aegis Vanguard. The descent into Sector 4 was grim. The air grew thicker, heavier, smelling of ozone and grease. The polished floors of the upper decks gave way to grated steel walkways and rusted bulkheads. As they approached the heavy blast door of the primary coolant nexus, David drew his sidearm, signaling for his men to stack up. The Kryn guards readied their halberds, power cores humming with lethal energy. "We breach on 3, David whispered to Vera. "Sovereign, please, if the human is dead, understand he was just a mechanic. If your sons are agitated, call them down." Vera ignored him, her massive hand gripping the manual override lever of the blast door. She ripped it downward, tearing the locking mechanism out of the wall with brute, terrifying strength. The heavy doors hissed and slid apart. The strike team flooded into the room, weapons raised, tactical lights piercing the steam and shadows. Vera pushed past them, her thermal vision activating, desperately scanning the massive, cavernous engineering bay for the heat signatures of her violent offspring. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" David yelled over the deafening hum of the generators. They expected a bloodbath. They expected to find the dismembered remains of a human mechanic and 3 feral alien hatchlings ready to tear the strike team apart. Instead, they found profound, unbelievable silence in the center of the room. There, bathed in the warm orange glow of the thermal generator, was a makeshift cot made of stacked shipping crates and an old grease-stained blanket. Lying flat on his back, dead to the world and snoring softly, was Samuel Reed. And sprawled across Samuel's broad chest, rising and falling with the deep, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping human, were the 3 missing Kryn princes. David lowered his gun, his jaw dropping. Helen Mitchell gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Even the Kryn royal guards froze in place, their weapons dipping toward the floor in sheer bewilderment. The hatchlings, each the size of a large dog and covered in jagged, terrifying obsidian scales, were completely pacified. One was draped over Samuel's neck like a spiked scarf, softly clicking its mandibles in its sleep. The second was curled into a tight ball directly over Samuel's heart, its razor-sharp tail wrapped loosely around the human's arm. The third was sprawled across Samuel's stomach, its heavy, armored head resting on the mechanic's chest, drooling a tiny amount of highly corrosive acid onto Samuel's thick, fire-retardant coveralls. None of them were attacking. None of them were panicking. They were purring. A deep, resonant, clicking purr that vibrated through the room. Sovereign Vera stepped forward, her towering frame trembling. She could not comprehend what she was seeing. In Kryn biology, warmth was life, but it was also dominance. To a Kryn hatchling, any creature that was not their mother was either prey to be consumed or a threat to be neutralized. Humans were frail. They were soft. They lacked armor or venom. Yet, this human possessed an internal body temperature that was a furnace compared to the cold metal of the station. More importantly, human biology, specifically the slow, steady, rhythmic thud of a resting human heartbeat, mimicked the vibrational frequency of a Kryn brood chamber. To the terrified, freezing hatchlings, Samuel wasn't prey. He was a giant, impossibly warm, vibrating, heated blanket. As Vera approached, her heavy footsteps clanking against the metal grating, the hatchling resting on Samuel's stomach cracked open one crimson eye. It let out a soft, warning hiss at its own mother, instinctively tightening its grip on Samuel's coveralls, not wanting to be separated from the incredible, radiating heat of the Death Worlder beneath it. Samuel groaned in his sleep, shifting slightly. The heavy strike team held their breath, terrified the movement would trigger the hatchling's predatory instincts. Instead, Samuel simply grumbled, wrapping a thick, grease-stained arm around the deadly alien creature on his stomach. "Keep it down," Samuel mumbled in his sleep, blindly patting the hatchling's heavily armored, spike-covered head as if it were a golden retriever. "Daddy's tired." The hatchling closed its eyes, let out a content trill, and went right back to sleep. Sovereign Vera slowly turned her head to look at Ambassador Mitchell, her four eyes wide with an emotion no human had ever seen on a Kryn's face before. Absolute, stunned awe. The silence in the primary coolant nexus was absolute, save for the rhythmic, vibrating purrs of the three alien predators resting on Samuel Reed's chest. Commander David Ross held his breath, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard of his sidearm. Sovereign Vera, the terrifying matriarch of the Kryn Empire, stood frozen like a statue of black obsidian. The tension in the sweltering engineering bay was thick enough to cut with a combat knife. Slowly, the heavy, grease-stained blanket shifted. Samuel groaned, his face scrunching up as the harsh glare of the tactical lights pierced his eyelids. He smacked his lips, tasting stale coffee and metal dust, before cracking one eye open. The first thing he registered was the blinding light. The second was the circle of heavily armed security officers aiming assault rifles in his general direction. The third was the towering 9-foot-tall alien nightmare looming over his cot, radiating an aura of lethal intent. Most humans would have panicked. Most humans would have screamed, thrashed, and inadvertently triggered the predatory instincts of the highly volatile hatchlings resting upon them. But Samuel was not most humans. He was a severely sleep-deprived mechanic who had just pulled a 14-hour shift in a 95-degree boiler room. Panic required energy, and Samuel was completely out of it. He blinked lazily, his gaze shifting down to his own chest. 3 pairs of glowing crimson eyes stared back at him. The hatchlings were awake now, their spiked heads raised, their mandibles clicking in a low warning rhythm as they sensed the anxiety radiating from the armed men in the room. The largest of the 3, the one draped over Samuel's neck, let out a sharp hiss, exposing rows of translucent, razor-sharp teeth dripping with corrosive saliva. "Well," Samuel muttered, his voice a gravelly rasp, "that explains the weird dream about the heavy blankets." "Samuel," David whispered over the station's local comms channel, his voice trembling, "do not move. Do not make any sudden gestures. We are going to carefully—" "Boss, turn the tactical lights off," Samuel interrupted, squinting through the glare. "You're pissing off the space puppies." A collective gasp echoed from the human security team. Ambassador Helen Mitchell's eyes went wide with sheer terror. Calling the royal heirs of the galaxy's most feared conquerors space puppies was a diplomatic catastrophe waiting to happen. But Samuel didn't care about diplomacy. He calmly reached up with his thick, calloused hands. The strike team braced for a bloodbath. Instead of striking, Samuel gently placed his hands over the hatchlings' eyes, shielding them from the blinding glare of the rifles. "Turn them off, David," Samuel grunted, his tone shifting to a no-nonsense reprimand. "They're nocturnal, by the look of those pupils. You're blinding them, and they're getting stressed." "If they get stressed, they're going to piss acid all over my favorite coveralls." Sovereign Vera's mandibles parted in utter disbelief. She slowly raised a clawed hand, gesturing to the Kryn royal guards behind her. Instantly, the guards lowered their plasma halberds and deactivated their armor's luminescent targeting arrays. Seeing this, David hastily signaled his men to do the same. The room was plunged back into the dim, orange glow of the thermal generator. Freed from the blinding lights, the hatchlings instantly relaxed. The largest one let out a trilling noise, rubbing its armored snout affectionately against Samuel's grease-stained cheek. Vera stepped forward, her heavy footsteps vibrating through the metal grating. "Human," she spoke, her guttural voice translated perfectly by Samuel's earpiece. "You possess no natural armor. You possess no venom. You are fragile meat. Why do you not tremble? Why do my sons not feast upon your soft flesh?" Samuel carefully sat up, wrapping his arms around the heavy hatchlings to ensure they didn't slide off his lap. They collectively weighed over 150 pounds, but the mechanic hoisted them with a grunt of blue-collar exertion. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but I've been bitten by plasma rats in Sector 7 and shocked by a 10,000-volt capacitor in Sector 2 just this week," Samuel replied evenly, patting the middle hatchling on its ridged back. "These little guys are just cold. Your life support up in the fancy suites is calibrated for human comfort, around 21 degrees Celsius. Look at their scales. They're exothermic, aren't they? They need ambient heat to jumpstart their metabolisms. They broke out looking for a radiator, and they found me. Vera stared at the mechanic, her mind struggling to process the interaction. In Kryn society, power was absolute. Weakness was exploited immediately. For a creature as fragile as a human to casually handle 3 apex predators without a shred of fear broke every biological rule she knew. To her, Samuel's lack of terror was not ignorance. It was a display of unimaginable supreme dominance. You protected them, Vera said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a tone of profound, terrifying reverence. You offered your own biological furnace to sustain my bloodline. I was just taking a nap, Samuel corrected, completely oblivious to the diplomatic paradigm shift occurring in the room. But they're pretty good at keeping the draft away. Now, if you want them back, you're going to have to take them slow. They're still sleepy. Before Vera could reach out to collect her brood, a violent shudder rocked the Aegis Vanguard. The metal floor panels groaned under immense stress. A shrill, localized klaxon began to wail from the primary coolant console. The ambient lighting shifted from orange to a frantic, strobing yellow. Warning. Warning. Core temperature critical. Coolant flow obstructed, the station's automated AI chimed, its calm voice a horrifying contrast to the screaming alarms. Samuel's nonchalant demeanor vanished in a microsecond. He practically shoved the 3 heavy hatchlings into Vera's massive arms, scrambling to his feet and sprinting toward the primary control terminal. His fingers flew across the holoboard, pulling up thermal diagnostics. Damn it! The lagging heatsink wasn't just lagging, it completely sheared off the primary valve, Samuel shouted over the roaring alarms. David rushed forward. What does that mean, Reed? It means the thermal generator is undergoing a localized runaway reaction, Samuel yelled, slamming his fist against a frozen digital dial. The heat is going to build exponentially in this chamber until the core melts through the deck and depressurizes the entire lower hemisphere of the station. Helen Mitchell paled. How long? Samuel turned around, his face grim. 4 minutes. Maybe less. Chaos erupted in Sector 4. The temperature inside the primary coolant nexus was skyrocketing, climbing at an unnatural, terrifying pace. Within seconds, the ambient heat surged past 45 degrees Celsius and showed no signs of stopping. For the human security team, it was deeply uncomfortable. Sweat instantly beaded on their foreheads, and their heavy tactical gear became suffocating. But for the Kryn, the rising heat was rapidly becoming a biological catastrophe. While the Kryn hatchlings required immense warmth to jumpstart their metabolisms, adult Kryn biology was vastly different. Their heavy, chitinous armor was incredibly effective at retaining heat, making them unparalleled warriors on frozen or temperate worlds. But in an environment of extreme escalating heat, their armor became a death trap. They could not sweat. They had no mechanism to rapidly vent internal thermal buildup. Sovereign Vera staggered, letting out a sharp, breathless hiss as her internal hemolymph began to boil. The royal guards behind her dropped their heavy plasma halberds, their massive legs trembling as heat exhaustion struck them with the force of a physical blow. The 3 hatchlings in Vera's arms began to shriek in distress, entirely unprepared for the sheer intensity of the runaway generator. Get him out of here! Now! Samuel roared, grabbing a massive, heavy-duty hydrospanner from his tool bench. We need to evacuate, David shouted, grabbing Helen by the arm and pulling her toward the blast doors. Reed, fall back. That core is going to blow. If I fall back, this whole station cracks in half, boss. Samuel shot back, pointing his spanner toward the massive, heavily shielded containment room housing the core. Through the thick transsteel glass, the generator was glowing a violent, blinding white. The automated safeties are fried. The only way to stop the runaway is to manually engage the emergency flush valve. Where is it? Helen screamed over the roar of the machinery. Inside the containment room, Samuel yelled, pulling on a pair of thick, silver-lined thermal gloves. David checked the environmental sensors on his wrist display, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Reed, are you insane? The internal temperature of that containment room is already breaching 110 degrees Celsius. It's literal fire in there. Your blood will boil. I'm human, David. We leak water to stay cool. I've got about 90 seconds before I cook. Samuel didn't wait for permission. He didn't look back to see if they were watching. He just turned and sprinted toward the heavy airlock door of the containment chamber. Sovereign Vera watched through blurring vision, her massive heart hammering erratically in her chest. She could barely stand, the heat baking her alive inside her own exoskeleton. Yet, this frail, unarmored Deathworlder was intentionally running into a localized inferno. It was an act of madness. It was an act of impossible courage. Samuel slammed his palm onto the airlock override. The heavy door hissed open, and a wall of blistering, superheated air blasted out, knocking him back a half step. It felt like stepping into an active volcano. His eyebrows singed instantly. The air burned his lungs with every desperate breath. He lunged forward, the airlock sealing behind him. Through the trans-steel glass, the strike team, the ambassador, and the dying Kryn matriarch watched the mechanic's desperate sprint. Samuel's coveralls were smoking. His skin was turning a violent, flushed red as his human biology kicked into terrifying overdrive. Millions of sweat glands erupted, dumping moisture onto his skin to aggressively fight the lethal environment, a biological parlor trick no other species in the Galactic Alliance possessed. He reached the primary turbine. The metal was so hot it was warping. The massive manual wheel for the emergency flush valve was jammed. Samuel roared in pain as his thermal gloves began to smoke. He locked his jaw, wrapping both hands around the scorching wheel, and pulled with every ounce of strength in his heavily muscled frame. His muscles screamed, his vision went black at the edges. "Turn, you piece of junk!" he screamed in his mind. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the valve broke free. Samuel spun it wildly, opening the floodgates. Instantly, thousands of gallons of sub-zero liquid nitrogen slammed into the reactor core. The blinding white light shifted to a dull, sputtering orange. The violent shaking of the Aegis Vanguard abruptly ceased. A massive cloud of white steam vented safely through the exterior exhaust ports, away from the station. The temperature in the containment room plummeted. Samuel collapsed onto the grated floor, his chest heaving, his clothes completely drenched in his own sweat, gasping for relatively cooler air. Moments later, the airlock was violently torn open. Not by David, nor by the security team, but by Sovereign Vera. The towering alien matriarch ignored the lingering heat. She stepped into the containment room, her heavy footfalls echoing in the sudden quiet of the dead turbine. She looked down at the human mechanic, who was weakly giving her a thumbs up from the floor. Vera slowly knelt, a gesture of submission completely alien to her kind. She gently scooped Samuel off the burning deck with one massive hand, cradling him against her armored chest with the exact same reverence she had shown her own hatchlings. "You stepped into the fire of a dying star," Vera rumbled softly, carrying the exhausted human out of the chamber as the medical teams finally arrived. "You endured the unendurable to save my brood, my people, and your own." Samuel coughed, a weak smile crossing his face. "Just doing my job, lady. Maintenance." Vera looked up, her 4 crimson eyes locking onto Ambassador Helen Mitchell, who was standing frozen in the doorway. "Ambassador." Vera's voice echoed through the destroyed engineering bay, echoing with unshakable certainty. "The Kryn Empire no longer seeks a mere trade agreement. We seek a blood pact. Your kind. Your incredible, resilient, terrifying kind shall forever walk beside the Kryn. Any enemy of Earth is now an enemy of the matriarchy." Humanity had not just survived first contact. By the grace of a sleeping mechanic and a broken heatsink, they had just gained the most terrifying guardian angels in the galaxy. The Aegis Vanguard's medical wing was a stark contrast to the grimy, sweltering boiler rooms of Sector 4. It was immaculately white, smelling faintly of antiseptic and synthetic ozone. Samuel Reed lay on an advanced diagnostic biobed, his upper torso heavily wrapped in General Electric dermal regenerator bandages. The chilled intravenous fluids pumping into his arm felt like ice water, a harsh but welcome reminder of the literal oven he had thrown himself into just hours prior. Commander David Ross stood rigid by the automated sliding door, his arms crossed over his tactical vest, looking down at a cracked military-grade datapad. Ambassador Helen Mitchell sat on a stool beside Samuel's bed, her usually pristine United Nations diplomatic suit crumpled and stained with soot from the lower decks. "You are an absolute idiot, Samuel," Helen said softly, though there was a profound, undeniable warmth in her voice. "A brave, monumental idiot. The Central Medical Suite estimates your internal core temperature reached lethal limits. Another 10 seconds in that containment room, and your organs would have systematically shut down. You bypassed every biological safety threshold known to medical science." Samuel let out a raspy chuckle, which immediately devolved into a painful coughing fit. "I told you, I sweat. Best natural cooling system in the galaxy. Besides, if I didn't pull that emergency valve, none of us would be having this conversation. Aegis Vanguard would be a cloud of irradiated dust floating in the neutral zone." David stepped forward, his expression hardening into a grim, unreadable mask. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, Reed. The thermal generator. You said the primary heat sink sheared off." "Yeah," Samuel replied, wincing as he shifted his weight on the gel mattress. The locking bolts gave way under the pressure. "Happens when the maintenance budget gets slashed by the bureaucrats back at the UN headquarters in Geneva. We've been requesting replacement parts from Lockheed Martin for 6 months." "That's what we originally thought," David said, turning the datapad around to show a high-resolution, three-dimensional scan of the destroyed turbine room. "But I had my security teams pull the wreckage from the blast zone before the area was officially quarantined. Those bolts didn't fail due to metal fatigue or budget cuts, Samuel. They were blown. Micro-explosive charges, strictly military grade, placed directly on the primary coolant line." Helen's face visibly paled, her diplomatic composure cracking. "Sabotage? But who would want to destroy the station with the Kryn matriarch on board? It would mean the total eradication of Earth." "The Terra First Coalition," David answered quietly, speaking the name of the radical human supremacy group that had plagued the political sphere for a decade. Radical isolationists. They believe an alliance with the Kryn will eventually lead to humanity's subjugation. They infiltrated the engineering crew. "We checked the security logs. Lieutenant William Campbell authorized a solitary inspection of the Sector 4 coolant nexus just 2 hours before the alarm triggered." Samuel stared at the sterile white ceiling, letting the horrifying reality wash over him. Humanity's greatest diplomatic triumph was almost turned into a galactic suicide mission by their own kind. "Where is Campbell now?" "In the maximum security brig," David growled, his knuckles turning white. "But here is the real problem, Helen. Sovereign Vera knows. Her royal guards possess olfactory sensors that can detect explosive chemical residue at a molecular level. When they swept the sector after your evacuation, they smelled the synthetic tetrial compound. They know humanity tried to assassinate them." The medical bay doors suddenly hissed open, saving Helen from having to formulate a panicked, politically viable response. Sovereign Vera entered. She had to duck significantly to clear the standard human blast doors. The terrifying matriarch of the Kryn Empire looked pristine once again, her obsidian armor polished and completely unbothered by the fact that she had almost been boiled alive. Behind her trailed the 3 royal hatchlings. They bounded into the room, their heavy, clawed feet clacking aggressively against the sterile floor tiles. Before David or the medical staff could stop them, the largest hatchling leaped gracefully onto Samuel's biobed. Helen instinctively flinched, retreating a step, but the creature simply curled its spiked body against Samuel's heavily bandaged leg, letting out a loud, rhythmic purr that literally shook the mattress. The other 2 quickly followed, piling on top of the injured mechanic like overgrown, scaly hounds seeking their master. "Careful," Samuel grunted, weakly patting the closest heavily armored head. "I'm a little crispy today, boys." Vera stepped up to the foot of the bed, her 4 glowing crimson eyes locking instantly onto David. "Your commander informs me that the malfunction was an act of treason, a deliberate, cowardly attempt by a radical faction of your own species to assassinate me and my royal brood." Helen stepped forward, her diplomatic training overriding her terror. "Sovereign Vera, please understand that this radical faction does not represent the Earth Alliance, nor the billions of innocent humans back on Earth. We will prosecute Lieutenant Campbell and his co-conspirators to the absolute fullest extent of interstellar law." Vera raised a massive, clawed hand, instantly silencing the ambassador, Do not apologize, Helen Mitchell. Every expanding empire possesses its cowards and its fools. The Kryn have faced rebellions, poisoners, and assassins for 10,000 years. It is the tragic nature of sentient life to fear what it does not possess the strength to understand. The matriarch's intense gaze shifted from Helen to the battered bandage mechanic resting comfortably beneath her sleeping sons. What truly matters in the cosmos, Vera continued, her guttural voice softening into a tone of absolute, unparalleled reverence, is how a species responds when the fire is ignited. Your traitor attempted to use extreme heat to destroy us, utilizing our biological weakness against us. But this man, this simple, unarmored worker of metal and grease, walked willingly into the inferno to save us. He shed his own water, burned his own fragile flesh, and endured the ultimate crucible. He proved to the matriarchy that humanity's true strength does not lie in its warships or its weapons, but in its impossible, terrifying resilience. Vera reached deep into the folds of her dark ceremonial cloak. She produced a heavy, metallic object, a jagged, beautifully crafted piece of incredibly dense Kryn tyrium steel carved with ancient, glowing, crimson runes. She moved forward and placed it gently onto Samuel's chest, right beside the sleeping hatchling. "This is the mark of the hearth," Vera declared, her powerful voice echoing through the sterile medical bay. In ancient Kryn culture, it is the highest honor bestowed upon a warrior who protects the sacred nesting grounds. From this cycle, until the end of time, Samuel Reed is recognized as a guardian of the bloodline. Where he walks, the Kryn shall walk. Where he bleeds, the Kryn shall conquer. Samuel looked down at the incredibly heavy alien medallion, then slowly looked back up at the towering alien queen. "Does this mean I finally get a promotion and a pay raise?" Vera's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Kryn equivalent of a booming, joyous laugh. "It means, Samuel Reed, that you now command a royal fleet of 3,000 dreadnoughts. Do not let their engines rust." The historic peace summit at Aegis Vanguard did not end with a formal signing in a grand boardroom. It ended in a cramped, sterile medical bay, with a heavily burned blue-collar mechanic, 3 sleeping alien predators, and an unbreakable pact forged in the fires of a failing reactor. Humanity had officially stepped onto the galactic stage, not as mere politicians or conquerors, but as the unbreakable shield of the stars. Humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology. It's our impossible resilience and instinct to protect, even when facing the galaxy's most lethal predators. Samuel Reed proved that a simple mechanic could secure an interstellar empire just by being a warm, fearless human. What would you do if you woke up with alien apex predators napping on your chest? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this sci-fi HFY story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our video channel for more epic tales.